The scent of cedar shavings usually brought Amos peace, but today it was drowned out by the metallic screech of a bulldozer's blade hitting the porch of his family's drying shed. Through the workshop window, he watched a red "Property of the Court" sticker flutter against the glass of his father's vintage bandsaw, while a process server handed him a document that made the floor feel like it was dissolving. The deed to Bear's Corner, the ancestral forest where his father's ashes were scattered, was no longer in his name. Amos turned to the only man he trusted, his lifelong friend and accountant, expecting to see a shared look of horror. Instead, he found Earl standing by the exit, thumbing through a leather briefcase filled with the shop's missing ledgers and a set of forged signatures. Outside, the heavy machinery roared to life, its exhaust clouding the air as it moved toward the tree line of the old-growth oaks. As the first branch snapped with a sound like a gunshot, Amos realized the man holding the keys to his survival was the one who had just locked the door from the outside. The steel of the chisel bit into the spinning cherry wood, and for a moment, the world narrowed to the point of contact. Amos Caldwell pressed his thumb against the blade, guiding it with a precision born of 30 years in this drafty workshop. A thin, translucent curl of wood, golden as a dried apple skin, spiraled away from the lathe, dancing in the afternoon light before settling into the thick carpet of sawdust at his feet. The scent rose to meet him, a sharp, sweet perfume of heated sap and linseed oil, a smell that had defined the air in his lungs since he was tall enough to reach the workbench. It was the only scent that made sense anymore. On the corner of the scarred walnut table, his smartphone vibrated. The device skittered across the uneven surface, its screen flashing a rhythmic, angry red. Amos didn't turn his head. He knew the sequence of those lights. The first was the bank, the second was the utility company, and the third, the most persistent, was the collection agency that had been hounding him since the spring. He focused instead on the curve of the cabriole leg he was shaping. His fingers, mapped with scars and permanently stained by walnut dust, traced the grain. He looked for the slightest shudder in the wood, the tiniest imperfection that would betray the lineage of the piece. Sweat beaded on his forehead, stinging his eyes, but he didn't wipe it away. He couldn't afford to lose the rhythm. Each shaving he took away was a step toward a perfection that felt increasingly like his only defense against the chaos outside these wooden walls. The bell above the door jangled, a harsh, metallic intrusion that shattered the hum of the lathe. Amos didn't need to look up to recognize the heavy, impatient stride. Earl Thompson brought the smell of the outside world with him. Cold air, exhaust, and a splash of that cheap, citrusy cologne he favored. Still at it, Amos? Earl's voice was too loud for the space, bouncing off the high rafters. He didn't wait for an answer. He moved through the workshop like a man inspecting a crime scene, his boots thumping against the loose floorboards. He stopped by a stack of premium black walnut, his hand slapping the top board with a sound like a gunshot. "This stuff is costing us a fortune. I saw the invoice from the mill. You're killing us, man." Amos flipped the switch on the lathe. The machine groaned to a halt, the silence that followed feeling heavier than the noise. "Quality costs, Earl. You know that. My grandfather didn't build this place on pine scraps." Earl reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, rectangular block of compressed fiberboard. He thrust it under Amos's nose, tapping the synthetic surface with a manicured fingernail. "Look at this. Pre-pressed, consistent, and a tenth of the price of that walnut. Under a dark stain and a thick coat of polyurethane, nobody knows the difference. Not the tourists, not the city folks looking for rustic charm. We could clear the debt in 3 months if we just switched the internals to this." Amos stared at the piece of engineered trash. He could see the glue seeping between the wood chips, a gray, lifeless slurry. He reached out, not to take it, but to snatch it. With a violent flick of his wrist, he sent the fiberboard sailing across the room. It clattered into the metal scrap bin with a hollow, tinny ring. "My name is on the bottom of every piece that leaves this shop," Amos said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. He pointed a calloused finger toward the darkened portrait hanging over the lintel. His grandfather, the first Caldwell to carve a living out of the Appalachian foothills, stared back with eyes as hard as flint. His name, too. We don't put the Caldwell brand on pressed garbage. If you want to sell sawdust and glue, go work at the mall. The mall is where our customers are going, Amos. Earl's face was beginning to flush a blotchy red. The bank doesn't care about your grandfather's ghost. They care about the red ink on my ledger. I'm trying to keep the lights on, then find a way that doesn't involve lying to the wood," Amos muttered, turning back to his workbench. He picked up a hand plane, seeking the solace of a manual task. The argument was cut short by a sound far more ominous than Earl's shouting. The front door didn't just open. It hit the wall with a violence that made the hanging saws rattle. Two men in charcoal gray suits stepped into the sawdust-laden air. They didn't remove their hats. They didn't offer greetings. They looked at the workshop with the clinical detachment of coroners. The taller of the two, a man with a jaw like a cinder block, stepped forward. He didn't look at Amos. He looked at the equipment. He pulled a roll of bright red stickers from his pocket. Without a word, he walked to the heavy band saw, the one Amos's father had bought in 1954, and slapped a sticker onto the cast-iron frame. "Property of the court. Do not remove." "Hey!" Amos's voice cracked. He stepped forward, the hand plane still gripped in his fist. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The second man, who held a clipboard, didn't flinch. "Amos Caldwell? We're here on behalf of First National. You've ignored the final notice, the secondary summons, and the mediation hearing. This is a formal inventory of assets for liquidation." Amos felt the air leave his lungs. He looked at Earl, expecting an explosion of legal defense. But Earl was strangely quiet. He stood by the walnut stack, his eyes fixed on his own shoes. The collectors moved with a terrifying efficiency. They didn't care about the history of the tools. They didn't care that the lathe was perfectly balanced or that the chisels were honed to a molecular edge. They saw weight, resale value, and scrap metal. Each red sticker felt like a cauterized wound. Amos watched as his world was mapped out in symbols of forfeiture. He felt a sudden, sharp pain in his chest, a frantic drumming of his heart against his ribs, like a bird trapped in a chimney. "This is a mistake," Amos whispered, though he knew it wasn't. "I have orders. The autumn festival is in 2 weeks. I'll have the money then." The man with the clipboard didn't even look up. "You've been saying that since the spring equinox, Mr. Caldwell. The bank is done waiting for the seasons to change." Earl finally stepped forward, his voice regaining some of its oily smoothness. He moved toward the collectors, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Gentlemen, please. My partner he's a craftsman. He doesn't handle the paperwork. I'm the one you need to talk to. I've been working on a restructuring plan with the city council." He turned to Amos, his expression a mask of practiced sympathy. He reached out and squeezed Amos's shoulder, his grip tight and possessive. "Give me the files, Amos, all of them. The bills, the notices, the letters from the sheriff. I'll take them to my office. My cousin is on the zoning board. We can freeze this. I'll handle the numbers. You stay here. Focus on the wood. Finish the pieces for the festival. That's our only play." Amos looked at his friend. He saw the sweat on Earl's upper lip, the way his eyes darted toward the red stickers. A part of him, a deep, instinctual part that knew the difference between a solid joint and a hidden crack, felt a surge of alarm. But the weight of the debt was a mountain, and he was tired of climbing. He nodded slowly. He watched as Earl gathered the stacks of unopened mail and legal threats from the desk, stuffing them into a leather briefcase with a series of sharp, metallic clicks. "I'll fix it," Earl promised, backing toward the door. "Just keep the saw running." The next few days passed in a blur of forced productivity. Amos worked until his vision blurred, preparing the exhibition stands for the festival. He and Earl moved the heavy frames to the backyard, the air outside smelling of turning leaves and the sharp, chemical tang of the paint Earl was using for the signage. Despite the red stickers mocking him from the machines, Amos felt a flicker of hope. He polished the tabletops until they reflected the swaying pines above, pouring his desperation into every stroke of the rag. It was a Tuesday morning when the mail arrived. The real mail, the kind that didn't come in a windowed envelope. Amos was walking back from the mailbox, sifting through a handful of glossy flyers for pizza and lawn care, when a heavy, cream-colored envelope caught his eye. It bore the official seal of the county land department. He stopped on the porch. The world seemed to go quiet. The birds in the oaks, the distant hum of the highway, the wind in the grass, all of it muted. He tore the edge of the envelope. His fingers were shaking so violently he almost dropped the contents. It wasn't a bill. It was a notice of title transfer and impending auction. His eyes skipped over the legalese, searching for a familiar name, a reason for this to be in his mailbox. He found it. Subject property, Bear Creek Lot 42, Bear Creek. The locals called it Bear's Corner. It was 15 acres of old-growth timber that had been in the Caldwell family since the 1880s. It was the source of his best oak, the place where he had buried his father's ashes, the very soul of his heritage. And it was being sold. Not for a mortgage he knew about, but for a series of private liens he had never signed. Amos didn't go back to the workshop. He ran to the house, to the archives he kept in a locked oak cabinet. He tore through the drawers, throwing old blueprints and tax receipts onto the floor in a frantic search. He reached for the hidden compartment behind the false back of the shelf, the place where the original land grants and deeds were always kept. The compartment was empty. The silence in the house was deafening. He fell to his knees among the scattered papers, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Someone had been in his house. Someone had taken the bones of his life. He didn't call Earl. He drove straight to the county records office, his old truck trailing a cloud of blue smoke. The building smelled of floor wax and ancient, decaying paper. He slammed his hand onto the counter, startling a young clerk who looked like she had just graduated high school. "I need the deed history for Bear's Corner," he rasped. Now, the girl clicked her mouse, the sound echoing like a ticking clock. Amos chewed his lip until he tasted blood. When she finally turned the monitor toward him, the world tilted. There was the signature. The A had the same sharp hook. The S trailed off in the same lazy loop. It looked exactly like his hand. But beneath it, in the space for the witness and the filing agent, was the name that broke him. Earl Thompson, power of attorney. Amos didn't remember the drive back to the workshop. He found himself standing in the center of the room, the smell of sawdust suddenly nauseating. Earl was there, casually wiping dust from a finished chair, whistling a tune that Amos didn't recognize. Amos didn't speak. He walked to the workbench and threw the printout from the records office onto the wood. It landed with a soft thud, but to Amos, it sounded like a falling tree. Earl looked down. He didn't flinch. He didn't even stop whistling for a second. Then he slowly looked up, his expression shifting from casual to a cold, clinical mask. "You weren't supposed to get that for another week," Earl said. His voice was flat, stripped of its usual frantic energy. Amos lunged. He grabbed Earl by the front of his silk tie, slamming him back against the walnut stack. "You sold it? You sold the corner? That's my father's land, Earl. That's blood. How did you get my name on those papers?" Earl didn't struggle. He looked at Amos with a pity that was worse than anger. "I saved you, Amos. You were drowning. The bank was going to take the house, the shop, everything. I moved the debt to the land. It's just dirt and trees." "It's not dirt," Amos roared, his grip tightening until Earl's face began to purple. "It's who we are." "Who you are," Earl spat, finding his voice. "I'm the one who's been lying to the collectors for 3 years. I'm the one who's been forging signatures on loan extensions just so you could spend 40 hours sanding a piece of wood no one can afford. You're a ghost, Amos. You're living in a world that died 50 years ago. I just gave you a graceful exit." Amos let go, not because he was finished, but because he felt a sudden, profound exhaustion. He looked at his hands, the hands of a maker, and saw they were trembling. "The exit isn't graceful, Earl," Amos said, his voice a ghost of itself. "It's a murder." The betrayal didn't stop at the land. 2 days later, a courier arrived with a thick packet of documents. It was the full contract. Earl hadn't just moved the debt. He had brokered a deal with a corporation called Green Valley Resorts. They didn't want the timber for furniture. They wanted the land for a wilderness retreat, which meant clear-cutting the old oaks to make room for prefabricated cabins and a paved road. Amos drove out to the boundary of Bear's Corner that afternoon. The sight made his stomach turn. The gravel road was already lined with orange survey stakes. A crew of men in neon vests was stretching rolls of chain-link fence across the trailhead. "You can't be here, sir," a man in a white hard hat said, stepping into Amos's path. "I own this land," Amos said, pushing past him. The man didn't argue. He waved over 2 guards in black tactical gear. They didn't ask questions. They grabbed Amos, one on each arm. When he tried to twist away, they kicked his legs out from under him. He hit the gravel hard, the sharp stones biting into his palms. They dragged him toward the road, his boots furrowing the dirt he had walked on as a child. They threw him into the ditch like a sack of refuse. "Don't come back," the guard said, his voice muffled by a helmet. Amos sat in the dirt, watching as a flatbed truck arrived, carrying a massive yellow bulldozer. The machine's engine roared to life, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the hills. The smell of diesel smoke drifted over him, thick and suffocating. He returned to the workshop to find Earl waiting. Earl was leaning against the lathe, his arms crossed. He looked at Amos's torn clothes and bleeding hands with a flicker of something. Regret, perhaps. But it was quickly swallowed by his resolve. "The bank froze the accounts an hour ago," Earl said. "They found the discrepancies in the filings. They're calling it fraud, Amos. But they're willing to drop the charges if we complete the transfer to Green Valley by Friday." "We?" Amos laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "There is no we. There's just a thief and a man who was stupid enough to trust him." He walked to the small safe in the corner of the office. He didn't need the key. He used a crowbar. He didn't care about the noise. Inside, he found what he was looking for. The practice sheets. Dozens of pages where Earl had practiced Amos's signature over and over until the muscle memory was perfect. "You've been planning this for years," Amos said, holding up the evidence. Earl didn't deny it. He stepped forward, his voice rising to a scream. Because you wouldn't listen. I told you to modernize. I told you to take the contracts for the hotel chains. You wanted to be an artist. Fine. This is what happens to artists. They get eaten. The argument was interrupted by the arrival of the sheriff. Dennis Hayes walked in, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He looked at the red stickers, the torn papers, and the two broken men. He looked at Amos with a deep, weary sadness. I have an order of attachment, Amos, the sheriff said. I have to seal the shop, all of it. The tools, the inventory. Everything is under court custody until the fraud investigation is cleared. Amos watched as the sheriff's deputies began to string yellow tape across his machines. They were thorough. They even tagged his favorite set of Japanese chisels. The shop, the only home he had ever truly known, was becoming a crime scene. Earl grabbed his jacket from the hook. He didn't look at Amos as he headed for the door. I'm taking the truck. It's in my name anyway. I'll be at the hotel in town if you decide to sign the final release. The sound of the truck's engine fading into the distance was the loneliest sound Amos had ever heard. He sat on a pile of sawdust, the darkness of the workshop closing in. The power had been cut. The hum of the machines was gone. In the silence, he could hear the distant, rhythmic thud of the bulldozer at Bear's Corner. He didn't sleep. He spent the night pacing the perimeter of the shop, his mind a fever of calculations. He called every lawyer in the county, but the answer was always the same. Green Valley has the paperwork. You have a forged signature and no money. You can't win. By dawn, he was back at the edge of the forest. The bulldozer was positioned in front of the old drying shed, a structure his father had built to air dry the massive slabs of oak. It was full of wood that had been seasoning for a decade. The operator didn't see him at first. Amos ran across the clearing, his heart hammering against his ribs. He stepped directly into the path of the machine. The operator slammed on the brakes. The massive steel blade stopped inches from Amos's chest. The heat from the engine rolled over him in waves. Get out of the way, crazy man, the driver yelled. No, Amos said. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He stood there, a man carved from the same oak they were trying to destroy. For 3 hours, he didn't move. The sun rose, baking the scent of diesel and dust into his skin. A crowd began to gather at the fence line, neighbors, people from town, even a few tourists who had arrived early for the festival. They watched in silence as the lone craftsman stood against the machine. Earl arrived in the afternoon. He climbed out of the truck, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and desperation. He walked right up to Amos, the two of them standing in the shadow of the bulldozer's blade. You're going to jail for this, Earl screamed. They'll charge you with interference, trespassing, everything. Just sign the papers and walk away with enough to start over. Start over where, Earl? Amos asked. In a world made of fiberboard and plastic? I'd rather die in the sawdust. Earl looked at him, and for a second, the mask of the businessman slipped. He looked like the boy who had once shared a treehouse with Amos, the boy who had been afraid of the dark. You're making me the villain, Amos. But I'm the only one who tried to keep us alive. You kept the ledger alive, Amos said. You let the man die. The stalemate ended when the sheriff arrived with a warrant for Amos's arrest. As they led him away in handcuffs, Amos looked back at the drying shed. The bulldozer didn't wait. The first blow of the blade shattered the cedar siding like glass. The sound of the wood breaking, the wood he had tended for 10 years, was a physical blow to his spine. He spent the night in a holding cell, the smell of bleach and old cigarettes a sharp contrast to the forest. but in the quiet of the cell, his mind began to clear. He thought about the house. It was the only thing Earl hadn't been able to touch. The title was held in a separate trust, a relic of his mother's foresight. The next morning, he made one phone call. By noon, he was standing in the office of the local credit union. He signed the papers with a steady hand. He was mortgaging the house to the hilt, a high-interest bridge loan that would likely leave him homeless in a year. But the check they handed him was enough. He didn't go to a lawyer. He went to the Green Valley office in Lexington. He walked past the receptionist and straight into the boardroom where the regional director was having lunch. "I'm here to buy back the liens on Bear Creek Lot 42, Amos said, throwing the check onto the mahogany table. "The auction is already set, Mr. Caldwell," the director said, not looking up from his salad. "We have a vested interest." "You have a forged contract," Amos said, leaning over the table. "I have the practice sheets, the witness statements from the neighbors who saw your guards assault me, and enough money to tie this up in court for the next 10 years. Or you take this check, you walk away with a modest profit on the debt, and you find another hill to pave over." The director looked at the check, then at the fire in Amos's eyes. He saw a man who had nothing left to lose, and those were the only men who ever won in court. Amos walked out of the office an hour later with a signed release of interest. The autumn festival was in full swing when he returned to town. The air was thick with the smell of kettle corn and wood smoke. He didn't have a booth, he didn't have a truck. He borrowed a flatbed trailer from a neighbor and hauled his 3 best pieces, the ones the deputies had missed during the seizure, to the very edge of the town square. He didn't have a fancy sign. He didn't have a sales pitch. He sat on the edge of the trailer, his clothes stained with dirt and grease, his hands raw. Earl walked by an hour later. He was carrying a suitcase, heading for the bus station. He stopped at the edge of the crowd, looking at Amos sitting among his hand-carved masterpieces. They didn't speak. There were no apologies left to give, no bridges left to burn. Earl just nodded, a short, jerky movement of his head, and kept walking. He disappeared into the crowd, a man of paper and ink lost in a world of substance. A man in a charcoal suit stopped in front of the trailer. He wasn't a collector. He was a man who knew the weight of a good tool. He reached out and touched the surface of the walnut table. He followed the grain with his fingers, his eyes widening as he realized the complexity of the joinery. This isn't factory work," the man whispered. "No," Amos said, his voice raspy. "It's a Caldwell." The man bought all 3 pieces on the spot. The price was enough to pay the first 6 months of the mortgage and buy back his tools from the bank's liquidators. That evening, Amos drove out to Bear's Corner. The bulldozer was gone, leaving a scar of raw earth where the shed had stood. But the oaks were still there. The forest was quiet, the air cooling as the sun dipped behind the ridges. He walked to the center of the grove. He found a fallen limb, a piece of white oak, seasoned by the wind and the sun. He sat on a stump and pulled his pocketknife from his jeans. The first cut was awkward, his hands still stiff from the jail cell. But then the rhythm returned. The wood yielded. The scent of fresh oak rose, sharp and clean, cutting through the lingering smell of diesel. He was broke. He was alone. His house belonged to the bank, and his best friend was a memory of a ghost. But as the first shaving of wood curled away from the blade, Amos Caldwell felt the weight of the world lift. He wasn't a ghost. He was a maker. And as long as there was wood in the hills and a sharp edge in his hand, he would never be truly lost. The forest breathed around him, a deep, slow respiration of ancient life. He stayed there until the stars came out, a solitary figure in the dark, carving a future out of the ruins of the past.